Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will be focusing on a recent book by Rosie Bsheer of Harvard University entitled Archive Wars, The Politics of History in Saudi Arabia, published last year by Stanford University Press. I'm Eric Arneson of the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. For over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, if not always, on Mondays, in pre-COVID times, in person at the Wilson Center, and since pandemic restrictions, in the virtual realm like this. And today's session, I should note, is being co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous individual donors. As always, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, you should note today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section, we ask that those with questions either use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. And for those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address is posted in the chat function. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn the screen over to Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian, Zoom room is yours.
Thanks so much, Eric. Make sure. Yep. Thanks so much, Eric. Wonderful to be here with all of you today. And again, thanks to our colleagues at the Wilson Center's Middle East program for co-sponsoring today's event. I'm very excited about today's panel and very much look forward to the discussion. We'll start off, of course, with Dr. Rosie Bsheer, who is Assistant Professor of History at Harvard University, coming to us all the way from a late evening in Beirut. Welcome, Rosie, to the Washington History Seminar. Rosie's publications include Archive War, the Politics of History in Saudi Arabia, published by Stanford University Press in 2020. The Limits of Belonging in Saudi Arabia, published in the International Journal of Middle East Studies last year as well. And A Counter-Revolutionary State, Popular Movements and the Making of Saudi Arabia in Past and Present, 2018, as well as How Mohammed bin Salman Has Transformed Saudi Arabia in The Nation, May 7, 2018. Dr. Bsheer is associate producer of the 2007 Oscar-nominated film, My Country, and a co-editor of Jadalia e-magazine. She received her PhD in history from Columbia University in 2014 and has taught at Yale University and Swarthmore College. Again, Rosie, congratulations on the book and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The floor is yours. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here to discuss my scholarship with you. Thank you, Christian and Eric, for the invitation, and Rachel for organizing the event. Shireen and Asher, I'm very grateful that you took the time to engage my work. Thank you. And of course, thank you for everyone else joining us today. I want to start with a few words about how I arrived at this work, and then briefly go over some of its major empirical and conceptual arguments. So Archive Wars is about bureaucratized everyday state efforts to normalize the history of Saudi Arabia through archives and the built environment. Studying these efforts, as the book shows, can tell us about the production of history itself, but especially about sovereignty, modern statecraft, and the nature of power. The book begins with a chapter on a fragment of sociopolitical and cultural life in 19th century Mecca, leading up to the establishment of the Saudi state in 1932. The chapter recounts one of the many possible futures that could have been, but never was. And it does so not as a nostalgic reclamation, but in order to show how the advent of the nation state necessitated certain archival occlusions, ones that rendered these actors invisible and their transregional networks mute. The book then details 3 pivotal phases of archive formation throughout the 20th century, and how these too repackaged and materialized history in the service of state formation. The last chapter, chapter 5, brings us back to Mecca, and this time focusing on urban life there from the 1950s up to the contemporary period, and how urban redevelopment was imbricated in the making of history. I became interested in historical knowledge production on Saudi Arabia sometime in the early 2000s, when I began to learn about leftist activism in 1940s and 1950s Saudi Arabia. And it was my first time hearing about these movements, let alone from a first-person account that captured the depth and breadth of people's political struggles, their fight against US imperialism and Al Saud authoritarianism, and the many losses they endured as they strove for what they saw as a more equitable future. The Saudi Arabia of those who had lived through these events looked nothing like mine, which at least initially was the one I had read about in books. The handful of academic books that had made any mention of these mid-20th century mobilizations until then did so dismissively and often in the context of US or Soviet foreign policy, or these powers' security concerns about the endurance of the Saudi state, the stability of the Saudi state. I found these narratives rather abstract, as if the popular leftist or Arab nationalist movements somehow operated without actors, without people, and as though these movements had not affected the course of Saudi history. Such approaches worked hand in glove with the Orientalist framing of Saudi Arabia as a place without history or politics, as a place without culture or civilization, as a place that owed its founding as well as its continued existence solely to its massive oil reserves. A few years ago, I published a paper, the past and present one, about the mid-20th century leftist movements and some of their main actors and some of the main projects. The challenges I encountered in researching the topic impressed upon me just how pervasive and stubborn Orientalist perceptions of Saudi Arabia were. Academics and non-academics from the Middle East and elsewhere could not wrap their heads around the idea that Saudi Arabians engaged in the same kinds of popular politics that prevailed in much of the colonized world in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, that I was pursuing this line of questioning shortly after the 9/11 attacks probably did not help. But even before then, these perceptions of Saudi Arabians shaped how scholars wrote about the kingdom and about its people. This research experience solidified my interest in the politics of historical knowledge production and how these shaped the archival landscape in the country. So initially, after writing about history textbooks in Saudi Arabia, I turned to the study of archives and the politics of their production. By the time I moved to Saudi Arabia in 2009, a whole archiving industry was already mobilized in an effort to produce a national archive, and in an effort to materialize a singular state-sanctioned historical narrative. Saudi Arabia had entered the last decade of the 20th century without a national archive to call its own. In theory, it had a national archive, the National Center for Documents and Archives that did exist, but in reality, it was far from being an archive, let alone a national archive. Some of the top rulers were for the first time intent on changing that. Now keep in mind that these very same rulers actively impeded national archive formation since 1966, which is when King Faisal issued the country's first archiving law. In the early 1990s, at least a few of these very same rulers began to endorse the archival project. And here I would like to spend a few minutes contextualizing the archive fever of the 1990s before returning to the archive wars themselves. For the top rulers, the 1991 Gulf War was a game changer. It featured a belligerent neighboring Iraqi government, and at the same time, a global recession that saw a fall in returns on Saudi investments worldwide. The popular opposition to Al Saud that strengthened during the war was very much key. Many of the wartime and post-war opposition movements used state-sanctioned religious rhetoric to discredit both Al Saud and the Wahhabi religious establishment. These movements opposed the regime's close alliance with the United States, especially as it manifested against another majority Arab and Muslim state, Iraq. The mass movement, the mass Islamist Sahwa movement, particularly stood out. It publicly revealed the contradictions of a self-proclaimed Islamic Saudi state that was authoritarian, economically unjust, and militarily reliant on foreign powers. Together, these movements called on Al Saud to sever ties with the United States, to curb military spending, and to implement a constitutional monarchy. Now, these were a few of the many ramifications that the regime had to contend with. The war and domestic reactions to it exposed Saudi Arabia's political, military, and economic weakness. It shook Saudi leaders to the core and convinced some of them that an overhaul of the political economic system was now necessary. Salman ibn Abdul Aziz, the current king, who was at the time Riyadh's governor, Salman was at the forefront of this push for post-war restructuring. One of the pillars of his plan rested on historical revisionism and on commemoration. In this endeavor, secular nationalism would gradually replace political religion as the driving force of history. The revised official historical narrative maintained many of its central tenets, but it would sideline the focus on the Wahhabi movement, and it would relegate the role of religious forces to the footnotes of state formation. Instead, the revised narrative would rest largely on Al Saud's patrilineal genealogy, and it would incorporate the country's symbolic and material history into that of Al Saud alone. This was the narrative that the regime sought to assemble through state archives and museums, as well as the built environment after the war. So the archiving industry was therefore mobilized in the mid-1990s to produce and centralize the archival record of this revised narrative. The archive became one of several preferred sites in which the regime waged its post-Gulf War battles. History was now a more intense form of politics than ever before. Its instruments, its institutions, its sites became weapons for reconfiguring the post-war polity. One of the plan's simultaneous goals was to channel political opposition away from the streets and into struggles for inclusion in the historical past, rather than in, say, economic redistribution or political equity. Archival institutions in Riyadh, where the regime's ideological and material power remained strong, became the grounds upon which it preferred to fight these battles. It's important to keep in mind that these institutions themselves had multiple and competing interests. Little did those in power anticipate that in trying to contain old rivals, new ones would emerge, and this time from within the archiving establishment itself. With Abdullah becoming de facto ruler in 1995 and then king in 2005 upon Fahed's death, the archive became an increasing site of competition between the new ruler and his half-brother and current king, Salman, who, by the way, was quickly becoming the gatekeeper of Saudi Arabia's history. In fact, given the pervasive rivalries among the top rulers, the archives they oversaw, or the archives that they had sway over, began to compete against each other over document collection. This ultimately fueled a race for historical records. Other citizens and residents also became embroiled in this struggle, as archivists, historians, archaeologists, as architects, urban planners, and owners of private property, or private archives, I should say. History became a battleground among the ruling elites and the archives they oversaw, and between them and other Saudi Arabians. Historical records were already scattered around the country, gathering dust in abandoned warehouses and in government buildings, sitting in private archives, or with tribes families and former bureaucrats, and circulating in the black market. Some were located around the world, held in foreign archives, for example, by foreign regimes and individuals, and by private auction homes or auction houses. As the race for collection intensified, historical records became commoditized in new and unprecedented ways. They were now being traded in local markets across Saudi Arabia, but also in global ones, in Cairo and Sana'a, in London and New York. One document could go for as much as 100,000 US dollars. Not surprisingly, an illicit market for both real and forged historical documents also emerged. In the process, document traders, especially in Egypt, played off one Saudi archive against the other to secure the highest bid for the paper collections they possessed. As you can imagine, these practices complicated the rulers' plans for archival consolidation. The book details the many struggles that archive formation entailed from the 1960s into the first decade of the 20th century, and it talks about their consequences to state formation and to Saudi power. For now, I hope that this overview gives you an idea of how repositories of primary sources became sites in which the regime waged its post-Gulf War battles over several things, over the reproduction of state power, sovereignty, and society. In the book, I theorize archives as both traditional repositories of records, but also of the built environment itself. So here, I want to shift gears and briefly discuss the spatial aspect of the work. And in fact, the archival politics I've discussed so far were part of a broader post-war national development plan. This is a national development plan that came into life after the war and centered specifically on urban space. The changing post-war political economy impacted a radical shift in official ideas about the utility of space and the utility of memorialization. The post-war plan rested on multi-billion-dollar heritage making in Riyadh, and this included archives, museums, and memorialization sites. And it rested on commercial mega development in Mecca. So in Riyadh, for example, the regime injected new life into sites that were, for the most part, long neglected and quite dilapidated. And it subsumed these sites within the broader flow of deification of Al Saud. In contradistinction to the deliberate manipulation of Riyadh's built environment, in central Mecca and right outside the Grand Mosque, the regime capitalized on the rhetoric of iconoclasm, coupled with that of modernization, to justify the violent erasure of much older historical and religious sites. Many of these were private endowment lands and evinced competing temporal and spatial orders. The regime destroyed them, even when many clerics within the religious establishment did not oppose the preservation of historical artifacts and sites, but only those religious ones that they thought would encourage shrine visitation, which Wahhabism prohibits. Planning documents, reports, correspondences, and interviews indicate that central Mecca offered a two-pronged solution to looming political and financial challenges. First, the post-war territorialization of Saudi Arabia's history necessitated the destruction of spaces that contested the official rendering of the past. Second, Mecca offered the regime much-needed lucrative investment opportunities, what with it having some of the most expensive real estate in the world. Actors in Mecca's redevelopment industry were intimately tied to the same networks of capital, power, culture, and knowledge production that had structured Riyadh's redevelopment. And these included Kings Fahd and later on Abdullah and Salman, the religious scholars who either opposed or supported the construction of secular heritage in Riyadh and redevelopment in Mecca, managers, archivists, and planners, and economic elites such as the Bin Laden family. And just like in Riyadh, alliances shifted. The interests of different power centers sometimes overlapped and other times diverged. In the process, development plans, goals, and trends changed. And just like in Riyadh, the lucrative projects further entrenched the economic elites within Al Saud's fold and tied them to the regime's political and economic longevity. So if archives were one side of struggle, Spaces of commemoration were another. The redevelopment of urban space entailed similar struggles to those seen in the archiving industry, although I should say that here the rulers were more powerful and they were more successful. It was harder for the regime to consolidate historical documents that were physically scattered than it was to control space. Those who opposed the regime's spatial plans could not contest or subvert space as they had done with the historical records in their possession. Many nonetheless tried, and these included property owners in Riyadh and in central Mecca, and included planners, lawyers, architects, and archaeologists. Significantly, perhaps, they included independent and establishment religious leaders whose opinions on commemoration and on the destruction of religious sites varied. In the book, I expand on these efforts, although I should say I had to dilute many so as not to give away people's identities in light of worsening conditions inside Saudi Arabia. The book also expands on the positions that contracting companies and the political and economic elites took. I delve deeper into the politics and the financial and historical thinking underlying the remaking of space in Riyadh and Mecca, and how various struggles mapped onto the remaking of both cities. Let me briefly point out here that the everyday practices I am describing in the realm of archives and space making are pillars of modern statecraft and sovereignty. They are structural to all states, even to those hailed as the most modern, secular, and liberal. We see similar struggles happening in places as diverse as Russia and China, Israel, and the United States. Recent scholarship has described very similar archival struggles there, and in places such as France and the United Kingdom. As I show in my work, what varies from place to place is the precise political economic stakes in the struggle over knowledge production and state form. In the late 20th century, in late 20th century Saudi Arabia, the struggle, what I call archive wars, revolved around the production of history, the reordering of space, and the repurposing of valuable real estate. This research allowed me to foreground the centrality of materiality to the state's history-making project, and here I'm talking about the materiality of documents, of artifacts, of buildings and spaces. It allowed me to approach these objects more generally as types of archives, that are designed to tell a certain story about the past and about futures that are in the making. As I write in the book on page 5, to pay attention to the life worlds of the built environment, the production and destruction of cities as archives, is to read physical geographies along and against the grain and how they lend themselves to state power. It is to understand the truth that erasure mobilizes, materializes, and normalizes in the service of state formation. History making and archiving reveal the contentions and complexities otherwise hidden in flattened narration of a singular and easily discernible Saudi state. They also reveal the precariousness and incoherence of the state, at the same time that they signal its dynamic and multiple nature. Institutional acts of history making put into question the coherence of historical narration, puts into question the coherence of memorialization. They expose archival anxieties, uncertainties, and rivalries among the architects of state building and their agents. Saudi Arabia's archive formation and its material politics more broadly makes that very clear. It helps us better understand the nature of Saudi power and the tensions inherent in the process of state formation. So just to conclude, to study the multi-pronged war over the consolidation of archival war in Saudi Arabia is then to underscore ruling ideologies, spatial politics, and layered temporalities. Now, far from exceptionalizing Saudi Arabia, such an approach speaks to mundane practices and struggles that go into the making of archives everywhere. For in their own ways, all archives are sites of war that embody and reflect inter- and intrastate and state society struggles over power. The power to subjugate the past to the politics of the present and to dictate the future. Rarely is the process of archive making, which like state making is always ongoing, visible to those outside the archival operation. The fraught conditions of archive formation remain opaque and lend themselves easily to notions of objective truth. If we are to challenge the amnesiac impulse that marks all national projects, the Saudi case is an instructive one. It can help us rethink the archive, the state, and how power constitutes itself. I'm going to stop here. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Rosie, for this excellent presentation. We are very fortunate to have two wonderful scholars to provide initial comments and to launch us into the discussion that I hope will involve many of our viewers as well. Professor Ashar Akarbi and Professor Shireen Sakali. We'll start with Shireen. Let me introduce her and then give her the floor, and then I'll introduce Ashar at a later point. Dr. Shireen Sakali is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She received her PhD in History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University and a Master's in Arab Studies at Georgetown University. She held the Qatar Postdoctoral Fellowship at Georgetown and the Europe in the Middle East Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. Sakali was director of the Middle East Studies Center at the American University in Cairo from 2012 to 2014, and she is the co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliyya e-magazine. Sakali's Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine, published by Stanford in 2016, explores how Palestinian capitalists and British colonial officials used economy to shape territory, nationalism, the home, and the body. It received the Middle East Political Economic Book Prize. Her forthcoming book, entitled From Baltimore to Beirut, on the question of Palestine, focuses on a Palestinian man who was at once a colonial officer and a colonized subject, a slaveholder, and a refugee. His trajectory from 19th century mobility across Baltimore and Sudan to 20th century immobility in Lebanon places the question of Palestine in a global history of race, capital, slavery, and dispossession. She has published in academic journals such as the International Journal of Middle East Studies and the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. We're delighted to have her here, and I'm happy to give her the floor now. Welcome, Shireen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for having me. It's a great honor to be with you. Our journey through the battlefields of history in Arabia begins with the figure of Muhammad Rahmatullah al-Qairanawi, known today as al-Hindi. Qairanawi was prominent in the 1857 rebellion against British rule in South Asia, and would lead 200 mujahideen from Uttar Pradesh to Delhi. In the wake of defeat and a British call for his arrest, he fled to Bombay, sailed to the port of Mocha in Yemen, and walked 1,000 kilometers north to Islam's holiest city, Mecca. Qairanawi would go on to establish Salatiyya, what would become known as the mother of all schools in Mecca, leaving a long intellectual and political legacy that combined Indian, Ottoman, and Arab reformist thought and practice. Qairanawi may appear as an unlikely figure to both the modern Middle East historian and the general observer of what we today know as Saudi Arabia, a name that registers a violent and ongoing destruction. But he was not anomalous. He was one pillar of a broader cosmopolitan world constituted from a diverse and dynamic fabric of ethnic, religious, intellectual, and political life worlds, ranging from South Asia to Portugal to the Eastern Mediterranean to North Africa. Through 5 page-turning chapters, Rosie Bsheer meticulously captures the life worlds of Qairanawi and the many like him who built and inhabited Arabia's intellectual and material infrastructure. Through years of multi-sided, investigative, and archival research, over 60 oral histories, and hundreds of interviews, ranging from historians and archivists, as she mentioned, archaeologists, urban planners, to feminists like Hatun al-Fasi, to Fahda bint Saud, the daughter of the much maligned and one of the most interesting kings of Saudi Arabia. And here I would urge you to read Rosie's article, The Rise of the Counter-Revolutionary State. It changed my life. I'm sure it'll change yours too. So basically, she's gathering a history here teetering on extinction. And by the end of the work, we see the demise of Qairanawi's Mecca, a Mecca where the Prophet Muhammad's birthplace is, in the words of one of her interlocutors, now under the Haram's public lavatories. A Mecca whose commercial land was worth $400,000 per square meter in 2013. Put this in comparison to an average of $21,000 per square meter in New York City. A Mecca where kings and the uber wealthy sit in the comfort of $3,000 per night luxurious hotel rooms linked through a bridge to the Grand Mosque. There they partake in prayer, separate from the noise, sounds, smells, and people of the annual Hajj, the pilgrimage that is meant to gather believers in spiritual communion, eroding distractions and social, national, and class divides, symbolized through the humble white robes that pilgrims don. A Mecca where, in a feat of major secrecy, the Ajyad Ottoman forces of the 18th century, the Ajyad Ottoman fortress, of the 18th century, its neighborhoods, and the 2 million cubic meters of rock that was Mount Bulbul fell to the force of dynamite, all to make way for a development project. A Mecca where centuries of ancient, medieval, and early modern worlds fall to the blades of the incessant bulldozer, powered by the present King Salman and his long-standing alliance with one of the world's most powerful and moneyed corporations, the Saudi bin Laden Group. A Mecca where the elderly and low-income residents of the holy city are violently dispossessed of their lands and relegated to the shadows of the high towers and the quote-unquote capitalist clock that sit on the ashes of the Hamidian clock that used to remind people of the 5 calls to prayer. How did we get here? And what does this have to do with history? The quick answer is that this destruction is born of the House of Saud, or El Saud's relentless attempts to create a secular history, a secular temporality, contingent on the brutal destruction of a multiplicity of pasts. In response to internal opposition and external economic and political crises, as Dr. Bsheer has already sort of outlined, in the wake of the Gulf War of 1991, the Saudi state went on a mission to destroy the past and create the material and archival foundations of a sanitized history that placed the regime above the religious establishments it relied on, as well as the multiplicity of opposition that has characterized 19th and 20th century history. Bsheer invites us to think of documents, the sites that house them, and the urban landscapes of Arabia as battlegrounds of history. Through the stories of thousands of documents abandoned, discovered, confiscated, stolen, and cataloged, she brings these documents into view as paper capital. We learn of what she calls the low-grade fever of the 1970s and 1980s. At that time, archivists and historians collected and cataloged documents in institutions like the King Fahd National Library and the Institute of Public Administration. There, various actors frustrated regime efforts to centralize government records and erase Arabia's diverse intellectual, political, and social topography. Bsheer moves us to the post-1991 period when the governor of Riyadh and today's King Salman attempted to centralize archival power and dominate the telling of history in his particular image. The Institute of the King Abdulaziz Foundation for Research and Archives, better known as the Dara, promised to civilize the ostensibly ignorant and backward peoples of Arabia's, and here particularly their sense of history. So here you see the state, or one arm of the state, and the disaggregation is a very important contribution in this book, the disaggregation of the state. So you see this arm of the state hoarding, confiscating, dispersing, and letting documents that did not suit its narrative basically rot in unsuitable and remote storage facilities. You also see mobile vans that promised to preserve people's documents, but actually confiscated and at times destroyed them when their stories did not meet the agendas of the regime. And far from their purported ignorance, people understood these efforts for what they were, another mode of dispossession. From the everyday citizen to the South Asian migrant laborer to the archivists and the Dara itself, people employed subterfuge and sabotage to resist the state's imperative of erasure. Document traders became power brokers, and the market in real and forged documents unfolded in bidding wars at auction houses like Sotheby's and physical brawls at sites like the Rare Manuscript Exhibition on Saudi Arabia. The longer answer to the question of how we got here is a story of the uneven palimpsest of state power, the inextricability of corporations and governments, the mutual dependence of nation and empire, and the ways that regimes both claim to represent while fundamentally abhorring the peoples that it rules. This longer story is one that should sound familiar to all of us. It is not about the seemingly exceptional expanse of desert, the stuff of Orientalist fantasies and Arab racist depictions. And yes, there is intra-Arab racism, and this is one of the important stories this work sheds new and crucial light on. It is in fact a story about us here today. And it's about us not only because the Saudi regime signed bilateral cultural cooperation protocols with the United States, among many other countries, to keep Saudi records locked in foreign archives, invisible to the gaze of scholars and everyday people. And it's about us not only because the Arabian American Oil Company has a central, in fact, a state role in Saudi Arabia in producing the archives of a state that erases all who came before it and who opposed it. But it's about us because it offers lessons on the politics of history that we ignore at our peril. Rosie Bsheer is an intellectual, historical, and archival guerrilla in the most studious and rigorous of ways. Through these surreptitious photographs that punctuate the work, through the tedious search of dusty and abandoned documents, through those measured and attentive interviews, she offers an archive of a world before, through, and across the machinations of nation and capital. More than anything, her invitation urges us to imagine different futures. And in that spirit, I have two questions for you, Rosie. One is about the praxis of grief. Every page of this work and every word of the expansive endnotes, a rich text on its own, register profound loss. As someone immersed in thinking through catastrophe, both historical and contemporary, this last year has felt both more isolated and less lonely. Catastrophe has been generalized as a daily experience, not simply or only for those flattened categories of the global South versus a seemingly homogenized and equally flattened global North. The rise of xenophobic authoritarianism, its attendant mechanism of rendering lies as the truth, and a global pandemic have meant that grief is a daily experience for many the world over. I wonder if you might reflect on grief as an intellectual and political practice. How does mourning work to shape this work? And how can we attend to mourning and loss to understand the politics of history? The second question also hinges on catastrophe. Your account disaggregates what you call the palimpsest of that is the Saudi state by revealing warring institutions, intra-royal competition and violence, the sub-state force or parastate force. I actually don't know. I'd be interested to how you might describe Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, in this regard, and the various everyday people who relentlessly and unevenly attempt to harness history. You explain time and again that the divides of public-private, the state and the corporation are some of the very fictions we must disentangle to understand the past and envision the future. You forcefully reveal the multiplicity of ways that states rely on failure as a mechanism of deferring popular demands and maintaining hegemony. In the wake of last month's catastrophic power outage in the state of Texas, a place that had its own archive war, with people literally freezing to death. Commentators sort of used the moniker of the failed state to describe Texas and the country more generally. For many of the disenfranchised in this country, this is not in fact an insight, it's not new, but rather a historic and contemporary reality. So here I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about how states govern through failure, how disaster and its ongoing kind of incitement is actually a mechanism of power. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sakali, for these powerful comments. Over to you, Dr. Bsheer. If you could please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for these very generous comments and these very important, if difficult questions that you're asking me. Let me start with your first question about grief and grief as an intellectual and political practice. So the issue of grief and loss are not ones that I anticipated or prepared for when I went to Saudi Arabia. But they became almost central to the work. They accompanied me through my work in official archives, but also in private archives. And here I'm talking about archives in Riyadh and in Mecca, but also archives in Medina and in other parts of the country. I should say that even in those private archives that I accessed outside of Saudi Arabia, in the homes of the many exiled Saudi Arabians as well, the sense of grief and loss were very much present, was very much present. Grief and loss also accompanied me in my work on commemorative spaces. Both, I mean, I write about Riyadh and Mecca, but I did work on spaces across the country, many of which did not make it into the book. And there, the grief of trying to repair what was damaged, what was lost, what was dilapidated in terms of the commemorative spaces was very much present. Now, while I did my research, I was struck by the intensity of people's attachments to the past. Attachments through records, objects, spaces, memories, of course. And here I want to just insist that not all who mourn the past were against the ruling monarchy. Many of Al Saud supporters also held on to the past that they imagined. And importantly, at least in my work, these attachments only grew with the archive wars that I describe. As the state project to centralize archival records grew, so did the possibility that the regime would, I should say could and would, strip people of their private records. The regime, of course, had already done that with many of the spaces that they called home, that people called home. And so they became more protective of the records in their possession. And, whereas many of the private archives that I worked with initially didn't really know what to do with these records. They belonged to their fathers, mothers, grandparents. Now with the 1990s, they became increasingly attached to these records because now they were under threat. They started to consider them as private property. They were the only evidence, the only material evidence they had of their place in a past that was seeming increasingly distant to them. It's a past that they didn't necessarily identify with, the top-down state history, but nonetheless one that they wanted to sort of force their own history into. People's attachments, what I just described, really contrasted with the cold and sanitized ways that plans for archival and spatial consolidation took place. The detachment of some state planners, the detachment of the archivists and archaeologists and architects. Again, not all, but many of them. So on the one hand, there was a matter of fact, this instrumentality, this instrumental attitude of many of those enforcing the history project. And on the other hand, you had mourning and urgency of those who saw the state project as a loss. And some of the state enforcers were among those who saw the project as a loss and tried to obstruct it, as you mentioned, Shireen, in your comments. So even some of the archivists tried to obstruct the work of archiving, the orders that they got. I think you called it subterfuge. The same happened with planners, archaeologists, and in some cases architects, where they tried to actually salvage some of the spaces that were slated for destruction. So as a historian, it was a fine line to navigate. But loss ultimately led me to interrogate what was not there, what had been erased, what had been demolished. It led me to seek out traces of past that I wasn't even aware of, but it was the sense of loss that actually took me there, which is why in the book I write about erasure as a form of history, not just what is material and present, but what is absent. And I should say that the comments you made about loss and grief are only ones I ever get from Saudi Arabians themselves. I often, regularly actually get emails from people in Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabians outside of the country who start to share their stories of loss and grief, and who see this work as a kind of reclamation for these pasts that, many of them are aware of, but couldn't necessarily sort of talk about or show or discuss. That's all I'll say about grief and loss. I write about this, I think, in the preface of the book as well. Your second question is, in a sense, a much more difficult question for me to answer. Of course, I think this governing through failure is a feature of the late capitalist state. It's a feature of the late 20th century state in particular. One that existed before, of course, but it sort of deepened across the decades and into the 21st century, whereby, privatization is the ultimate goal. We saw that in Texas, we see that in Lebanon. These failures are by design. They're not by mistake, they're not by accident. And what the sort of goal is for non-states and specifically non-governmental actors, right? They are called on to do what the state once did in the past. I mean, living in Lebanon, this is very much present, a present daily occurrence, and has been for many years and increasingly so. And perhaps now with the increasing privatization in Saudi Arabia, we start to see that much more than before. But in my own work, failure was initially, I mean, it's not the kind of failure that you're necessarily talking about, but failure was initially the goal of the post-Gulf War archival project. I didn't mention this in my comments. The goal was never post-1990s. The goal was never to really build a functional archive, right? That was on the face of it. That was what the regime or some people within the regime were doing, Salman prime among them. That the goal was to consolidate all of these dispersed records within state archives, right? To hoard them, as you talked about, to hoard them and keep them in rotting in basements and archives and other institutions and other buildings. The goal was to make sure that these records could not be used by those who opposed the regime to make any historical claims against it. The goal was to hoard these records and make sure that whatever top-down narrative the state was sort of materializing in space and in archives was not easily challenged, I should say, because of course it's as I mentioned, very difficult to consolidate all of these archival records. And I only discovered that failure was the goal very late in the research phase, where I accidentally stumbled upon several financial budgets, let's say, of the Ministry of Finance, specifically targeting the Dara and other archives and detailing the functions that they would fund. And the funding was simply about collection. And many of the minutes I saw of different meetings, try to push for increasing funding for other aspects of the projects of archiving, and the Ministry of Finance simply refused to do that. And so I dug deeper, and I then understood that this was a struggle between Salman and Abdullah in particular. Whereas they agreed on some aspects of the work, they disagreed on what to do with it. They agreed that they needed to hoard as many records as possible. That is something they agreed on, and that is something they sort of allowed to happen. So in this sense, failure was the goal specifically. And we can see this, of course, in many other aspects of daily life. Again, not just in Saudi Arabia or Lebanon, but elsewhere. You talked about Texas. In Saudi Arabia, we have, you had regular instances of flooding of Jeddah that in 2010 became a national issue, where you had several people who died because of it. Of course, it wasn't the first time that such infrastructural projects fail. And they failed specifically because of these sort of competition and rivalries between different state institutions, whereby, nobody wanted to take responsibility. And the assumption is that it happened, right? We know that it didn't happen. In fact, there were discussions of the infrastructural system never being built, right? So again, a kind of failure that was quite detrimental to the loss of human life and to the loss of homes. But again, it becomes part of the daily functioning of the state, and its complete disregard for people. And again, I don't want to exceptionalize Saudi Arabia here. We saw that in the various hurricanes that happened in the US in the 21st century, and we see that happening in Texas and other places in the United States today. So I'll stop here.
Thanks so much. Before I introduce our final commentator, let me just remind our viewers that you have 3 ways to join the discussion. You can use the raised hand function in the Zoom functionality. That's our preferred way because it's the most direct engagement with the panelists. You can also use the Q&A function to write out a question. We could still try and call on you if you're in the audience. And third, you could also email your question to Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org if you're following us on Facebook, viewing us on Facebook. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our second commentator, Dr. Asha Orkabi, who is an associate research scholar at Princeton University's Trans-Regional Institute, and we're proud to say, currently a residential fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. He earned his PhD from Harvard University in International History and Middle Eastern Studies, and is co-author of Beyond the Arab Cold War, the International History of the Yemen Civil War, 1962 to 1968, published by Oxford in 2017. Orkabi is also the author of Yemen, What Everyone Needs to Know, published this year by Oxford University Press. Over the course of the current conflict in Yemen, Asha has contributed regularly to Foreign Affairs, National Interest, and many other policy publications, and has commented on both English and Arabic media such as C-SPAN, Al Jazeera, and Al Arabiya. His current research focuses on the history of chemical warfare in the Middle East. Asha, welcome back to the Washington History Seminar. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you for the invitation, Christian. And it's always an absolute pleasure to hear Dr. Bsheer. She's always giving wonderful presentations that inspire me to go off and do my own research, and certainly never slack in the rigor of that archival research. And certainly archive wars, and I'll keep this very brief because I see some really great questions coming into the Q&A. But I'll keep these comments and questions very brief so that we can get to Dr. Bsheer's answer. So looking at archive wars really contributes to dispelling this whole generation Orientalist critique that decries the relative dearth of Arab archives generally in this historical record as not being open to researchers of Middle East history and international history more generally. And in fact, this book opens up a whole new generation of potential historical research in Saudi Arabia, a country that, as Dr. Bsheer had said, has previously been inaccessible or difficult to understand, but has also gradually come to dominate the Arab voice in the 21st century. And certainly a country we need to contend with as historians. So the first comment I'll make is regarding the book's really rich narrative and character building. And it's something that historians take for granted, is the fact that we can make a story out of history. And Dr. Bsheer really does that well. And there's a lot of characters that come about, and you start following the character development in a really effective way. And I think one character that really caught my attention was Yahya ibn Junayd, who emerges as this pioneering Saudi activist, earns his PhD in library and archival studies, and is depicted as almost this heroic figure with some shortcomings, but certainly someone who's breaking the glass ceiling for this library and archivism within Saudi Arabia. So the question that I'll ask regarding this, Rosie, is Ibn Junayd the exception, or is he the founding figure of a new growing field of study in Saudi Arabia? Is the expansion and availability of historical archives, even as part of this state historical project, is this expansion of archives a reflection of a new study, a new expansion of history, the history field in Saudi universities, or even among Saudi students studying abroad? And will there be a whole new generation of Saudi historians that we can expect in the 21st century? Is this a harbinger thereof? And are they going to be looking towards Yahya ibn Junayd as their leader? The other piece is this question of secular nationalism. And the book is filled with some really wonderful symbolism, both as Dr. Sekali mentioned, the images, but also your depiction of history through construction, through celebrations, and through specific decisions made by the Saudi royal family. And there's one that caught my attention specifically, and that's your depiction of the 100-year celebration in 1999 of Abdulaziz Al Saud's conquest of Riyadh. So you give all the various different other celebrations that could have marked this very important moment, whether with Wahhabi Islam or one of the others, and instead focus on this one, the reason that Abdulaziz Al Saud's conquest of Riyadh becomes a very important moment in this construction of this secular nationalism. So in this point, you point to this statewide effort to construct a sense of Saudi national identity, which is interesting because we're really faced with two different images of what Saudi Arabia is. And I was hoping you can help us reconcile these two images. So one is where Saudi Arabia is the keeper of Mecca and Medina and the orchestrator of the Hajj on the one hand, while on the other hand, you have this idea of the emerging nation state on the other. It seems almost surprising and would raise eyebrows that the state that is so closely associated with Islam and with religion is looking to create a secular national identity. It almost seems like an oxymoron. So can you explain a little further, why is the kingdom seeking this alternative to an obvious religious legitimacy? Why not continue to hark on that? And within that same question, this whole title of Archives War, it's an interesting use of phrases, because who exactly is fighting on the other side of this war? So we understand the Saudi kingdom and its policies to control history, but who is fighting the state in its mission to rewrite history? And has this other group, however you choose to define it, also declared war against the state, and in what form? And similarly, you point to a lot of other instances, both in your talk and in the book, of states trying to control the archives. And I was really racking my brain while reading this. Is there any modern state that doesn't try to control its historical records? Possibly a state, think of the Iraqi state archives that were conquered, that were apprehended by the US occupational forces might be your case, but every state seems to try to control its history. So how does Saudi Arabia different? And this last comment slash question is regarding archives itself. So you've made such effective use of really seldom used archival resources, and a lot of which I wish they were footnotes rather than endnotes, because I was turning pages so frequently to find out where this information was coming from. I was really very pleasantly surprised, and you've really brought to light a whole new wealth of historical knowledge. But the majority of the focus is really justifiably on domestic affairs. And state building progress. Do any of these archives address Saudi foreign policy? And to researchers more generally, what might another researcher expect to find in these archives, assuming that they'll continue to be open to the public in some form or another? And this last one was more of a curiosity. What was your most surprising archival find while researching for this book? What document did you find that you made note of and you said, oh my goodness, I can't believe that this was written down? And that's more of a curious personal note, but I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Bsheer, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more of your answers.
Thanks, Asher, for some very thoughtful and penetrating comments. I love the questions there at the end as well, given that the Wilson Center is home to the Cold War International History Project, so we're always interested in the international side of things as well. Over to the archival gorilla, Rosie.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you so much, Asher. You've given me a lot to think about, and I can't possibly respond to everything you asked, but I will respond to a couple of things. I'll start from the end, actually. So many things surprised me. Just let me start with that. A couple of incidents in particular, so perhaps not specific documents, but a couple of incidents were very telling and surprising. So when I went to Saudi Arabia, I just knocked on doors of archives. I did not use any connections. I did not write beforehand. I just showed up. And so this wasn't common practice at the time. And what I found was that I was extremely welcomed by most people, researchers, historians, archivists, everybody that I worked with, which I was not expecting. And the archives itself, I kept going day after day, and this wasn't common practice. And they didn't know what to do with me. So they just kept letting me in, and I just kept going in, and you can't photocopy anything. So I was, old school. And months into my work in one of the archives, I won't necessarily say which one of the archivists came to me and said, I think you would be interested in this newspaper. And, up until then, the archivists weren't especially, just generous as most archivists usually are. And I took this newspaper, and this newspaper I had been looking for 2 years. Right, and I simply could not locate it. And she gave me one issue of the newspapers, and I took it and I copied the whole thing. It was about 12 pages, word by word. I copied everything, and then you can make a request to get a copy of records. And every copy you want, you have to fill out a form, a one-page form, and then something called the scientific committee goes through it and decides whether you get a copy or not. And so the next day when I came back to the archive, there was a copy, and it was 2 pages long. And so when I inquired into it, the archivist who had given it to me said, no, you must be mistaken. It's only 2 pages long. And I tried to argue, but there was no point. And suddenly all of the records of that particular newspaper disappeared, and it was no longer there, because what happened was that this archivist had flagged it to me. I requested it. The committee did not know, of course, because most archivists do not know what really is in their possession. And they sort of pulled it and made sure that nobody would access that. And, interestingly, I found that in a different archive, and this is the second example I wanted to give you, where I went to work in this particular archive, which is many floors, very, very big archive. And I found myself to be the only person there, and I was given the key to the primary source materials. And so there I was, thinking Saudi Arabia, it's the most difficult place to go to. Research is so difficult. And yet I was in this archive all alone with all of these documents and records. And that's where I found this particular newspaper, and I managed to get the several decades copies of it. This paper, it's called Al-Adwa, and it really portrayed the struggles that Saudi Arabians went through in the 50s and 60s, in the late 50s for the most part. And some of the discourses that they adopted against first Aramco, then oil imperialism, then US imperialism, then Saudi authoritarianism. And you see that in the daily struggles and the writing, first among people who use their real names, and then they use pseudonyms for protection. And so this, I think, was one of the biggest sort of finds that allowed me to really change the way I think about Saudi Arabia of the 1950s and 1960s, and the standard narrative about Saudi Arabia under King Saud versus King Faisal. I won't necessarily get into that because I want to get into some of your other questions. One of the things that I found interesting early on in researching, as I had mentioned in my comments, history textbooks, right, is as I was doing that and writing about history textbooks, Mecca was being destroyed. And so these things, there was sort of a clash. These things did not make sense. How could Saudi Arabia, right, which used Islamic legitimacy, the rulers themselves used it to legitimize their own rule, how could this be happening? And so, you mentioned nation state. I mean, the nation state emerged in 1932, and the form of nationalism that took place was a religious nationalism that I argue in the 1990s became too threatening to the regime itself. Because here we're talking about a religious discourse among those in the popular opposition that came from the heart of the Saudi religious school of Saudi Wahhabism, right? Yes, they were influenced by other religious movements, but these activists in the Sahwa movement, most of them went to school in Saudi Arabia. They studied the religious discourse and rhetoric that Saudi students study. So this was more threatening than, say, in 1979 with the takeover of the mosque, where you had somewhat of a fringe movement taking over the mosque. And of course, this was happening at the same time as an uprising in the Eastern Province in 79. And these two movements at the same time happening were crushed very violently, very quickly. And the media, there was sort of a blackout on the media, whereby the discourse that came out of Saudi Arabia on these two things happening simultaneously is that these are Shia terrorists. So they were able to sort of undermine both movements, or at least the takeover of the mosque in particular, which of course was by a Sunni group, simply by saying they were a fifth column Shia terrorists. They couldn't do the same in the 1990s. We're talking about millions of people who subscribed to this movement and who became much more public about their opposition to the rulers and to the ways that they, that they conducted their business. And they had a lot of allies among the Saudi population beyond these religious movements. Business people, elites, other kinds of activists who actually stood with them. And publicly, right, this is very important, publicly critiqued Al Saud for many of the things they had done. And, of course, allying with the United States was a big one, but the purchase of military weapons was a huge one as well, because of the billions of dollars spent on US arms at a time when there was poverty inside Saudi Arabia and quite uneven development occurring across the state. So to the outside world, perhaps it might seem, a bit shocking that Saudi Arabia would be doing that. But in fact, starting in the 1990s, there was a sort of an overhaul that you don't see on the face of it. That just looking at what the government says and the pronouncements and speeches, you do not see what the actual sort of project on the ground is with the destructions of space, the very specific curation of space across Saudi Arabia. I only talk about Riyadh and Mecca because these are the two projects that the state was first preoccupied with. Everything else, with the exception of maybe a handful of sites, Al-Ula and others, were neglected completely, allowed to deteriorate on their own. And this is where their efforts were, because Mecca, of course, real estate, as we talked about already, is one of the most expensive in the world. But Mecca is also one of the most visited place in the world. And for Saudi Arabians themselves, internal tourism was not a thing. So even for Saudi citizens, Mecca is where they went. Mecca is what they saw. And so to go to Mecca and see these historical sites that negated what the official history they studied in school and in the museums, for example, said was a problem. And this became very clear, even speaking with the planners, right? This was a nonchalant occurrence in every meeting I had with the planners in Mecca. This is a young monarchy that has to build its history, that has to create history, and this doesn't look good. We have to destroy this. We have to remove this. We have to erase this. This was a regular thing in the many meetings that I had with them. Thank you for the comment on, all states controlling their archives. That's exactly the point I want to make. And the point I make, the reason I make that point is because Saudi Arabia and the Gulf more broadly is so often exceptionalized, right? This is the exception. I was at a Mesa roundtable once where one of the archivists at the British Library, who was working with the Qatar National Library on the union they had to, digitize, I think up till now, 1 million records that pertain to the Arabian Peninsula. And she was lamenting the ways in which Qatar, the folks at the National Library in Qatar, were putting pressure on the kinds of documents that were being digitized. And she was calling on us academics to talk to the Qatari government to do something about it. I mean, to think that academics had any power, let alone that kind of power, was really very humbling and funny. But, I said to this person, I said, it's quite easy to continue with exceptionalizing the Gulf when what you're lamenting is exactly the same thing that regularly happens at the National Library in the UK. Scholars have written, Carolyn Elkins, my colleague, and others have written about the history of the UK National Archives and the ways in which the intelligence, MI6, and other agencies had to vet these records to make sure in the 1960s, that none of the records incriminated the violence of the British colonial officers in the colonies. This was perhaps in the 60s, but even into the 2000s, this was a regular occurrence, whereby, initially there were records, let's say, on Iraq that were readily available in the 2000s. And you go into 2010s and you ask about them, they're no longer there. And so when you dig deeper, apparently these records were burnt without copies being made of them. And of course, the excuse that the National Library uses is one that many archives use. We have no space, right? So again, this is absolutely the case that all states curate their archives and their histories. And, so on the one hand, I wanted to de-exceptionalize Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And on the other, I actually wanted to show how these things are in praxis, because we don't often get the opportunity to do so, to witness and experience how this is actually happening, how this curation is actually taking place. I wonder if I should stop or I should. The issue of the footnotes and endnotes, let me just say, I've decided that if I ever write a second book, I'm going to publish it with a press that allows me to write footnotes and not endnotes, because I agree with you. It's very disruptive to the reading process. But, I'll stop here. Thank you so much, Asher, for your great questions.
Thank you. What a fascinating story. Let me bring in some questions from our audience. William Nash writes, did you discover any special references to the role of history of the Saudi Arabian National Guard that impacted on the historical record, especially during the reign of Abdallah?
Not under the reign of Abdullah, because that was too recent, right? And so many of these records are still classified and not part of the archives I was looking at. But there were many on the National Guard much earlier on in their formation and before they actually became known as the National Guard. One example is, archiving was a very capital intensive in some ways process. And many of the institutions of government in Saudi Arabia did not have the funds to organize, catalog, archive, and preserve some of their records. But yet they produced so many of these records and they did not know what to do with them. And what most ministries ended up doing, because they had no space, is to rent or buy warehouses in the desert and just dump a lot of these records in there. And so at some point, there are folks in the defense ministry and in the National Guard who are writing to the central government and asking for permission to destroy all of the records in their possession. I couldn't find out if they actually did or not. I saw the request. I did not see whether they actually did that. But beyond that, these were not records that I was looking at specifically, the National Guard. There's a lot on Abdullah, but I did not look at the National Guard in particular.
Thank you. Asha and Shireen, feel free to chime in on some of these questions as well. Rosie might enjoy a brief break, but let's go on with a question from Michael Goodman. What types of Saudi documents are in demand at international auctions? Since you mentioned those. Yes.
For the most part, anything related to King Abdulaziz ibn Saud himself. So when I mentioned that one document could go for $100,000, the $100,000 documents are usually on Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And these are oftentimes records kept by people who were in the pay of Abdulaziz ibn Saud. They came to Saudi Arabia as experts, quote unquote, as consultants, people who worked in the oil company, right, at Aramco later on. As we know, many of the executives at Aramco also had their personal records, and many of them would take them with them. And now some of these are available in different archives and libraries in the United States, Georgetown, Princeton, and others. In some instances, you had photographers who were hired who also had copies of these photographs. And so you regularly had some of these photographs being auctioned at Sotheby's or Christie's. So these are mostly records that are not easily available abroad. So it's not records that you can find at the British National Library or at the Ottoman archives in Ankara or Istanbul. These are records of people who, for whatever reason, usually for work reasons, were in Riyadh with the king or his sons later on, and who had copies of records or images or videos in some instances. And these are, once the document collectors sort of got word of the wars happening early on in Riyadh and Saudi Arabia more broadly, they started talking to each other. And so they began to understand that these were desired, and they would seek them out. They would find, for example, there's an Italian photographer who was known in Riyadh and who had a massive collection. So they went and found this person living in a tiny village in Italy and tried to buy the records and images that this person had. And so these are the kinds of records that you saw in London and New York in particular.
Thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. How would one combat the way Arab governments neglect or attempt to change their historical narrative? I've been a librarian, archivist in the Arab world for many years, and through my working with how governments store information, I have to say that it is extremely disappointing. Never mind the way they just want to preserve what keeps them in power. A very sad situation indeed. Thank you for a very enlightening topic.
Thank you. Does Shireen or Asher want to take this one?
I mean, I think the way that we combat those processes is precisely to have and support scholarship like Rosie's and scholarship like Asher's and many others, right? That I think on the one hand, as I feel Rosie has made really clear, this is not exceptional to Arab states and governments. And I think that in many ways, scholars of the Middle East have innovated ways to think about archives, again, across a disaggregated understanding of the state. And so for some of us, we look for archives in places that you might not actually think of. And so I think that it requires both supporting and uplifting those types of innovative strategies. And if you allow me, I mean, Rosie, if I get this wrong, please correct me, but Asher put forward this question about the archive war that I think is linked to this conception of the Arab state. Like, Asher was asking, well, who are the warring sides, and is anybody declaring war on the state? And what I understand from this book is that the warring sides are within the state. The warring sides are different at times, institutions that are themselves battling one another, whose alliances with the ruling regime and different members of the ruling regime are constantly shifting. And we see this when, Salman's attempt to centralize archives post 1991, I think, as you said, Rosie, that the attempt was actually to fail, right? And that the multiple different institutions were actually pushing back against this dispersal and failure. So I think the invitation here is to think more critically about disaggregating what we understand as the state, not seeing it as singular, and really attending to the multiple sites that we can both take seriously and attempt to infiltrate, just to maintain the guerrilla metaphor.
Thank you.
This is great, and I should just add that this is a great question, and thank you, Shireen, for bringing it up. I should also add that this was also a war that many other Saudi Arabians who have nothing to do with, state institutions, who got sort of roped into it precisely for the reasons I talked about earlier in terms of attachment, right? Getting attached to kinds of histories that you still want to see, that you're afraid of this one homogeneous top-down history just dominating everything. Because there are many local histories in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, they do exist. There's a lot of diversity and heterogeneity in the histories that are written across the country. And that is what threatens, I think, some of the rulers the most. And so you did have many of these private archivists who became part of these wars, who, despite the lack of resources, began to digitize all of their records because they were so worried that once Salman becomes king, he was going to, make it the law that you had to give up all of your records in your possession. And so some of them went to courts because they refused to give the government their records, and they have court cases that are still lingering. And so it brought in multiple people as well. So beyond the institutional, which, as Shireen said, I was trying to sort of disaggregate the state in showing that, also trying to show how different people became embroiled in this. Even the archivists themselves who obstructed the work became part of this, because some of them were part of the Sahwa movement. And they were against what the regime, what Salman in particular was doing. And so they sort of resisted from the inside.
Great. We're quickly running out of time. So let me try and get a couple more questions in. On the issue of private archives that was just mentioned, a question from Marina Ottaway at the Wilson Center. Could you tell us more about the kind of documents people sought to preserve in private archives? And then we have a question from Ambassador Jim Smith. Rosie, in my meetings with people from Jeddah, they often reminisce about Mecca and Medina that decades ago, they were the centers of intellectual debate about all ideas in Islam. Their frustration was that debate was marginalized by the emergence of one Salafist interpretation. Did you sense this in your study of the rewrite of Saudi history?
These are great questions. Thank you. So private archives, it depends. There's quite a huge diversity of what many of them had. So in many instances, these were the archives of former notables who lived in Medina, lived in Mecca, lived in the south or the east, or even within Riyadh, who were mediators of sorts during the late Ottoman period, and who have a lot of Ottoman records, and later on many records written in Arabic during that period. Some of these notables remained mediators even after Abdulaziz ibn Saud and his conquest wars up until 1932, and even after the establishment of the state in 32, for a couple of decades, these notables remained very important. And so they again kept accruing records, specifically because Saudi Arabia did not have any serious institutions and ministries, let's say, until the 1950s. So you had a couple of decades where it was these notables producing the records who then were remained in the family and whose grandchildren, for example, now have and are using. There are archives, neighborhood archives, where, you know, records of 1979, the takeover of the mosque, record of 1979, the uprisings in the East. A topic that is dear to my heart is what I started with in my comments earlier on. You had neighborhood archives that had a lot of the pamphlets in the 1950s of popular movements across Saudi Arabia, a lot of literature that was produced at that time as well. And so again, there's a diversity among these archives that are increasingly, I mean, you can imagine how difficult it is to find and access them. They've become almost impossible to access unless you know someone very closely since Salman became king. And you can imagine why. You know, it's not surprising, to respond to the ambassador, but it's not surprising that people in Jeddah perhaps would feel this way, would reminisce about Mecca and Medina. I often get this response to my work where, yeah, of course, people in Jeddah have this, right? It's not surprising. You know, they lament the loss of Mecca and Medina. They lament the loss of the Hijaz to Al Saud. I want to say that this is a sense among people across the country, even, and you know, we don't have much information about this necessarily in the scholarship, but especially inside Riyadh and in Najd in particular. And it's not, you know, we think about, as you said, this homogeneous Wahhabism, right? As if it was a singular religious doctrine. Wahhabism itself was a very diverse religious doctrine, if you want, or an ideology. We only know about Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab precisely because of the political project. All other strands of Wahhabism are also sidelined, erased, silenced. We don't know much about them, and they're not allowed to, you know, the debates that they used to have in the 19th century are not ones that anybody or any of them are allowed to have now. So there is a sense of loss even there among many people who know about this, among many intellectuals, among many activists, that with not simply with this one homogeneous religious doctrine, but with a very particular kind of sociability that Al Saud allows, that silences almost everything else that does not include or center on Al Saud. So that these centers of knowledge, I mean, some of them, of course, still exist. Medina and the University, or the Islamic University of Medina, is among the most impressive in the Muslim world. But for the most part, the 19th century and what Shireen so wonderfully described, right? These centers of learning are no longer necessarily centered in Mecca and Medina for these reasons.
Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing, Christian?
Sure, sure.
Because
Absolutely.
I saw a question earlier on in the Q&A about foreign researchers accessing archives, and I just want to say, foreign researchers in Saudi Arabia have more agency and power than Saudi Arabians themselves in accessing these archives. This is something that is quite tragic, that Saudi Arabian students are, for the most part, not allowed to access their own archives. The reason I was allowed to access the archives is because they read me as someone who was from the United States, who came from an Ivy League institution, and who sort of had the credentials that they were looking for. But I often encountered Saudi students who were only allowed to access the archive for 1 day. Those who were lucky would access it for 2 days. And the topics that they researched if they went to university in Saudi Arabia, you know, were given to them by their supervisor. So just to say that, you know, we as non-Saudis have much more access to the archives there than Saudis themselves.
Thank you. That's important to raise. Let us close with a question by Farah Pendeth, who is the special representative to Muslim communities. She asks, thank you for your excellent presentation. Wish I had known more about your work prior to writing my book on extremism. Can you kindly tell me more about what needs to be done to illuminate to mainstream audiences the impact of the destruction of heritage in Mecca and why it matters? Maybe a short answer in closing this really great discussion. Rosie.
I always say that I'm a historian. I just tell you what past problems are. I don't tell you how to solve them. I leave that to the political scientists. But tragically, I will say that most of this heritage has already been destroyed. So I am not sure there is anything to be done. I mean, sure, there are several things that remain, some of the architecture of the mosque, some of the graveyards that are very important religiously and historically. But for the most part, almost everything has been destroyed. And so, you know, there is nothing I can say about that in particular, sadly.
Thank you. With thanks to Rosie, Asha, and Shireen, I'll turn it over to Eric for some final words. Eric.
Thanks, Christian. And thank you, Rosie, our panelists, and those of you in the audience. Apologies to those whose questions we couldn't get to. But we invite you to join us again next Monday on March 15th at 4 p.m. when we return to discuss the fall of Reza Shah, the abdication, exile, and death of modern Iran's founder by Shah Bakhash. Good night and take care.